Hi, everyone. I'm Elisha. I'm one of the Hardwired staff, and I'm here to introduce Doug Bandow. He is a writer who has written extensively on issues of government, and he's written two books related on the theme of governments interacting around the world. And right now, he's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. And his work has appeared in major publications such as Time and Newsweek and the New York Times and Washington Post, all publications I'm sure you could recognize. He's here to help lay the foundation of the relationship of government between government and the people. So Doug, thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be on. Well, greetings to all of you in South Sudan. It's nice to make contact. I'm sorry I can't be there. I visited in September with Hardwired and very much enjoyed my visit, enjoyed meeting people. For me, it's always very important to actually understand what's going on in the world and talk to people who are there and try to see a country and talk to folks who actually live there and are making that country move forward. So I hope in the future that I can come. At least technology allows us to connect at this very difficult time, and I wish you very well. That I hope you are doing well under these very difficult circumstances, and I hope that the work Hardwired is doing and that the talks that you're getting can help you as you move forward with your country, because we all obviously face challenges, and ultimately South Sudan will become what you make it, and the government you come up with is going to be very important, and it's one that needs to be based on what you and the other people in South Sudan desire and what's best for you all. And I think, when we want to talk about government, it probably would help if you just start thinking about your government and how it fits, as I talk about these issues. I mean, there are many different systems, and the question is, what kind of a system do you have, and what would you like to turn your system, into? One question is, who is supreme, in a governmental system? You look around the world and you ask about your system. Is God supreme? Are the people supreme? Is the government itself supreme? It can be any of these different systems. They operate very, very differently, in terms of who is the ultimate power, who is the ultimate sovereign and has authority. And you need to ask that about, your system. Within your nation, what system, what officials are supreme? Is it the executive? Is it a president? Is it a legislature? Ultimately within the government, who makes the most important decisions? That's going to vary by systems, and your system is likely, to have its own unique features. Within your system, what level of government is most important? Is it the national government? That's very common in other countries. Or is it a local officials? Is it local systems, provinces, other kinds of systems? Which one is more important within your system? What is the role of government? Governments, I think, in many ways operate differently. Some of them view the role of government as essentially controlling the society, as controlling the people. Other governments view their responsibility as helping the people themselves make decisions, help the society move ahead, where the government is more a helper than the controller. What kind of a system, do you have? Where do human rights fit, within your system? And where do human rights come from? What is the view within South Sudan? Do human rights come inherently from God? Do people in your system believe that human rights come as kind of human nature and what we are? Or do people view human rights as coming from the government, that are basically bestowed or supplied by the state? That matters in terms of how your government is operating. There's also the question of the rule of law. Every country has laws, but there's a difference in how they operate. Is basically the rule of law the sort of system where everyone is under law, that laws are made for the people, that laws apply to everyone? Or is it, in a sense, rule by law? That is, it's a rule of men, but they use law as the mechanism of control. These are different systems. A rule of law applies to everyone, including those who rule. A rule by law is one in which certain people are able to use that and apply those rules to others. And what is the role of religion, in your government? Again, there are great differences around the world, and you want to think about how your system is looking at this. Is essentially religion above both government and man? Is it the top? Do people look at religion as the ultimate? Or is government the ultimate under which both religion and human beings exist? Or is it a kind of a mixture where God is on top, but then there's the government and the state, and then the people come? Which system does yours seem to fit with, and how does that affect how the government operates? All of these have very different impacts, and they matter a lot in terms of where you're going to try to set up new systems, or if you're going to try to amend a constitution, if you want to adopt reforms. All of these are likely to start with the government that you have, so it's important to think about what that government is. And as we talk about these issues, how does your government fit with this, and then how do these issues fit with your government? There are a number of different models of government around the world, and no one is correct. The American system gets a lot of attention, but that doesn't mean the American system is the right system, and certainly doesn't mean it's the right system for you. You need to look at different systems, look at the rules, and ask what fits best for South Sudan. One mode of government is democracy, and that's where you have a free election. You decide on who is elected to be your leaders. But there are different forms of democracy. Now, one form of democracy we call a Republican system, and that doesn't mean the Republican Party in the United States. It means a system of a republic. That is, people vote, and ultimately all elected officials are answerable to the voters, but a Republican system is based on the idea that you don't want pure democracy. You want to have institutions that help protect human rights. You want institutions that help protect minorities, that guarantee that a majority cannot take unfair advantage of those who don't have political power. So you look at different systems within government in terms of balancing power in different branches. You look at constitutional provisions. You look at independent courts. We would call that a Republican system. And then there's pure majoritarianism. In that system, whatever the people want, they can have. So you can elect a government, and essentially that government elected by the majority can do anything that it wants. We would call that a majoritarian system. Very democratic, but it does mean that a majority might do things that you don't like, others don't like, which minorities within your society don't like. And finally, there are authoritarian democracies. That is, these are systems where there are votes, but then the rulers act in ways that seem very unfair. They use the system to try to take advantage of it. They often use the system to try to win extra votes, to make it harder for people to compete with them. One could look perhaps at a system like Turkey and others. One could argue they are that kind of a system. There are elections, but these systems don't seem very fair at the end, and they look very rough towards anybody who's not allied with the president or with his party. You also have systems that can be monarchies, and we still have some of those, or you have an aristocracy, and their political authority is inherited. And there are really two sorts of monarchies these days. One of these is constitutional. That is, the monarchy plays a role. The monarch would be head of the state. The monarch would kind of meet visiting dignitaries. The monarch will help choose who is going to form a government, say. We see that in the United Kingdom as one. We see that in Japan. We see that in a number of European countries. And then there are also absolute monarchies. That is, monarchies where the monarch really rules. This is a system where you inherit the power and you have all the power. This is not a power that's shared with elected officials as it is in, say, the United Kingdom. This is a power that you have. A country like Saudi Arabia would be an obvious example of a monarchy. The Gulf countries, most of them are monarchies. This is a very important model, in a sense, of government. And there are other ways you can look at politics and look at governmental systems. One is not just democracy or monarchies, but you have systems that are either authoritarian or totalitarian. Now, authoritarian tend to be governments, I mentioned Turkey, where the government has very strong powers over people. But it exercises those powers primarily in the political realm. Authoritarian systems usually don't worry about what God you worship. They don't worry about how you spend your time. They don't worry about what you believe about other things. Totalitarian systems typically want to control the whole person. I mean, though the famous systems that were totalitarian were the Nazis, they were the communists, and especially because of communism, the Soviet Union most obviously, China still today, North Korea. These are systems that still exist. They're models out there. They're not ones certainly I would recommend, but these are forms of government that are very important and need to be understood. When you mix religion, it becomes even more complicated. The question of how religion mixes with any of these systems. And in fact, you can have a totalitarian kind of religious system. Saudi Arabia probably would fit that. So these are systems where religion can fit with almost any of them. It can fit with a democracy, fit with monarchy, fit with these other systems. And there's theocracy, where essentially religion runs the state, where the government is supposed to act based on religious principles and usually based on what, say, religious leaders argue. There's also, I would argue, you might call it a tyranny, which is where the state runs religion, where the state has all this power and it essentially uses religion for its own benefit. It tells those in religion what to do. Again, I might point to Saudi Arabia, where the crown prince today, the king, they make the big decisions and they tell the people in religion, this is what you need to say, this is how you should behave. And there are clerics, there are imams and others in Saudi Arabia who are in jail because they refuse to do that. That's another model. And then there are constitutional systems. The United Kingdom has an established church, but that church doesn't have any real power. It's kind of a cultural symbol, it's historic, it has meaning for people, but their religion is present, but it's certainly not part of the government. The US steps away from that. The US has a very active religious community and many different faiths, but they have no official political role. So that the religion there is in society. The religion is not part of the government. There are other questions that you might ask, of how you want a government to operate. One is, what kind of a constitution do you have? The United States and most countries have formal written constitutions. Some countries have informal constitutions, both the United Kingdom, Israel and others, where they don't have something written down. Now, there's still a sense there's a constitution. That is, it's an understanding of practices, it's an understanding of history, of tradition, of the way government is supposed to operate. I mean, the United Kingdom has nothing that says Parliament can't sit forever, that a prime minister could come in and say, well, we're voting not to have elections. That would be understood, however, as going against the Constitution. That's an experience, as opposed to one that's written. I like the idea of a written constitution. Nevertheless, systems that have informal constitutions are democratic and they can work. In contrast, have been systems that had constitutions like the Soviet Union and never followed them. They talked about all the rights that citizens had, but they never actually practiced them. So it's not enough to have a constitution, even a written constitution. There has to be a commitment to follow it. There has to be a means to interpret it, to apply it. That usually goes to the courts. But when you're thinking about constitutions, not enough to write one, it has to be enforced. And you can mix these systems together in very different ways. North Korea is kind of a communist monarchy. It proclaims itself to be a communist state, but we are now on the third generation where sons have ruled after their fathers. It's very strange, but it shows that in the world, there is great diversity of governments. We certainly saw, I mean, I mentioned as a tyranny in a sense, Saudi Arabia, there was Francisco Franco's Spain. This goes back a number of years. He was a fascist at the time of World War II. He was a Catholic. So he basically used the Catholic Church as part of his ruling structure. So we've had these kinds of systems. And then democracy, you see systems that are very secular. You see systems that are much more religious. There are a lot of differences that one could look at as you're looking around the world. And I encourage you to do so. As you think about constitutional reform and maybe a constitutional convention, you think about legislative reform, look at what's out there and see what you think fits best. Within all of these systems, you have different aspects of them. You can have a system that is unitary, that is, it is very centralized in power, where all of the local governments are merely outgrowths of the national government, which can give authority as it wishes. That has long been, say, the United Kingdom, where Parliament rules, but they have decided to devolve power. So there is now a Parliament in Scotland. They've done the same thing with Wales, Northern Ireland, that they have been willing to devolve power and its real authority, but it could be pulled back by the center. Or you could have systems where the power is much more diffuse, where the power actually originates elsewhere. Federal system, this is one of the United States, where the US has a strong central government, but it has states that have independent power. They have their own constitutions. Even under the national constitution, they have unique authority. There are some areas that are viewed as their authority, not the national government's authority. So here, the second level is also very important, and it has an ability to stand against the national government in certain areas. And this is one where one may choose to change that over time. The US has changed its constitution. The US also had a civil war many years ago that effectively changed the power of the states. It said the central government clearly had the supreme power. But federalism, you see that elsewhere as well, preserves another level of power. And you also have some very decentralized systems where the central government is fairly weak and where instead the local governments are most powerful. In some cases, you almost have a system of sovereign authorities that are brought together and simply have given some of their power to some central authority, but they have decided to retain most of that power. Switzerland is a country kind of like this. It started out very much as cantons, as provinces. They came together, but the power in the central government is relatively weak. And you could make the same argument about the European Union. It presents itself as an international authority, and it is. It has a foreign minister, it has a president, it has a parliament, the European Parliament. Nevertheless, most of the powers remain with the individual countries. So when it comes to budgets, and this is an issue they debate, the question of how do you have this international institution if it doesn't have its own, power to set budgets and it can't rule over individual countries, but countries guard this very, very carefully. So all of these are different systems that show you different models you can have, within your own country, which are very important. The question then, what system do you prefer? And it depends on a lot of issues, philosophical issues, practical issues, that only you can decide for South Sudan. First is, where do rights come from? I mentioned this earlier. Do rights come from God? Are they inherent to the human being? Are they something which governments, as a rule, must defend because the right comes first before the government? In a sense, you have a system where the ocean, where the sea is one of rights, and where the islands are government powers. Now, do you have one where they're essentially bestowed? That is, they're dependent. Does the government decide what your rights are and therefore protect only the rights it desires? In that case, the government power is the ocean, and the individual rights are the island. These are two very different systems that you need to choose. The question is, which rights? Lots of people claim all sorts of rights. Well, what are the basic human rights? It's easier if you say rights are derived from something we all understand, of God, for example, of a theological system, of a religion. That gives rights, some strength. Or are rights, do they come from just what human beings are? Or are rights something which we simply desire? And the more rights we want, the more rights we get. This matters a lot, especially matters if you're writing a constitution. What goes into the constitution? Who decides what those rights are? Who enforces those rights? This is something very important that you'll have to decide. The question is the role of government. Now, is government exist basically to represent the people, and not just the people, but their interests? That is, I talked about the difference between pure majoritarianism and a Republican government. Pure majoritarianism gives the people whatever a majority wants. And you can argue that really does represent the people. But a republic, I think I would argue, is a better system because it represents not just what the people's preferences, their desires. It represents their interests. That is, it says what's important here for people to be a good society. What's important here to take care of those who are in greatest need? What's important to take care of those who are minorities and don't have political power? So it argues that there are interests that sometimes people just don't get and don't protect well. And that the government's supposed to, in those cases, say, we know you're asking me to do this, but we need to do that. That ultimately we are better off, we are a better society if we do that. Or, do you want a system where basically government, in a sense, represents the state? It represents the government. It represents those of a particular class of people influence. It represents a monarch, a king. In that case, it rules over people, and it might have everyone's best interest at stake, but we can't always assume that the government and the state and those who are part of it know what's best for the people and should be able to substitute their interests instead of those for the people. But again, these are very different systems that you need to think about in terms of how you want to organize your government. And you can certainly see a mixture in these systems. No country operates perfectly, certainly not my own. Anyone who watches American politics knows. The United States has sinful human beings in charge and has many, many problems that other countries have as well. But you want to think about these sorts of issues. What kind of a constitution do you want? You probably want a constitution of some sort, and if you have one, you probably want to make some changes to it. You want to look at the practical and the philosophical issues. My view is you want a system where the people are ultimately sovereign, but you like a system where they feel responsible to something else, whether that be God or some larger sense of a transcendent. You want people to recognize that there is something they are ultimately answerable to, and that is important, especially for those who are rulers. You want them to recognize that their authority is limited, it is constrained, and they are accountable. You want a system of human rights. Even if you don't believe in God, you can certainly believe that the human person has something unique about it and should be protected, and that human rights should reflect that. You want a system where that's rooted and it helps protect all of us, even minorities, even those without political power. It helps protect them because they must be protected in any system that's a good system, that's a just system, that's a fair system. The question of what kind of a democracy, I like Republican governments because they do limit to some degree what we can do when we are answering the worst elements of our human nature. And every once in a while, the bad takes over. And all of us, I think, have faced that, and sometimes a majority acts very badly. It's good to have something that try to limits that. I think it helps to have separate branches. You want an executive that decides how to act on the law, how to implement the law, but you want something separate, usually a legislature, to decide what the law is. Judges are important. An independent judiciary is very important because it helps insist that even rulers must respect the law. That, without that, it's a very dangerous kind of system. A system that has separate levels of government seems very useful. People who are closest to you probably understand your problems best. Some of those problems they should handle, they shouldn't be handled at a national level. So I think a federal system has a lot to be said for it. And I like a written constitution because then everyone really understands what it is. Like I said, informal, constitutions, unwritten constitutions can work, but you want to recognize there can be problems with that. But again, it's a system that you need to decide. And there are many issues that are just purely, I would argue, practical and prudential. Do you want a parliamentary system or a presidential system? Many countries have each. You want a system of proportional representation, or do you want a system where you have to get a majority of votes? These are issues that different countries decide on differently. There's no right answer. If I had to choose, I'd actually choose a parliamentary system over America's presidential system, but that's just my preference. So you should look at these different systems. Sometimes you can combine systems. You can have proportional representation for some seats, and then you can have individual seats that people get elected to. Do you want to have districts? Do you want them set out, in terms of geography for different provinces, or only based on population? Does your government run based on political appointees or permanent appointees? Different systems operate differently. But I think you always want to ask, how do you maintain transparency so everyone knows what is going on? How do you maintain accountability so political officials have to be subject to the sovereign people? How do you maintain honesty in government? I mean, everyone has trouble with corruption. I mean, the US has its issues as well. Countries and developing countries often have very serious problems there too. How do you preserve the liberty and human rights of people? How do you ensure a system that's prosperous for everyone, that shares the prosperity? It doesn't limit it just to a few, but everyone shares in that. Some systems do better than others when you're looking at these issues. Again, only you can make these decisions. And I want to emphasize that we're talking about the government for South Sudan, not the government for America, not the government for the United Kingdom, not the government for somebody else. We're talking about your government. You and other people in South Sudan have to make that decision. I would hope you'd look at different systems out there. I'd hope you consider them, you'd think about them. But in the end, you have to decide what system best represents your values and your principles. What system do you think is best at respecting human rights that you appreciate, that you think are important? What system is best to serve the public, the people in South Sudan? What system do you think is going to be best at delivering human services that are so important? The needs in South Sudan are very great. What government can help best meet them? What system is best in terms of what you think of your community and the culture that you have, your shared tradition, your history, your values? All of these things should go into your decision in terms of what kind of government do you want. And there's usually more than one good option. I don't believe there's only one system. As I mentioned, I would actually change the American system if I could. It's very hard to change. It's deeply rooted. I'm not worried about that. But if you're coming at your system, in a sense, almost new, you're a very young country. You have an opportunity here to try to create a system that works well into the future. You have more options. And this, again, is only a decision you can make. And you need to make it prepared, debating among yourselves. Talk with each other. Talk with those who you know, people in other fields. This is a decision that your whole people needs to make. And it's not just enough to get a system you like. You have to create a system that can survive for the future. You have to educate people. You have to help create and encourage civil society. You have to create civil and social institutions that can help people as they act in the political system. You have to build a civic ethos of people working together, of being able to disagree, of accepting the fact you're going to lose an election. That happens in America. People get frustrated, but you have to live with that. All of these are things that have to be worked very hard to establish. All of these are necessary ultimately to make government work. So I want to wish you the very best. You are working, and trying to create a better society in very difficult circumstances. Your history has been an extraordinarily difficult one. I applaud you for your ability to work together and to work on these issues despite poverty, despite the problems that still come from the civil war that you suffered through and all of these things that you've had to deal with. You know, you need, I think, God's help, and I wish you very strong support. And, you know, ultimately, the future is yours and it's not mine. I hope that what I've talked about can help. I'm very excited to see Hardwired involved. Hardwired does extraordinarily good work around the world. They are committed to you. I mean, their vision is one of helping to prepare you for this future. I hope that I can help you with this future. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions, and hopefully those will be helpful as well. And ultimately, I hope to come back to South Sudan and meet you in person. Thank you very much.